Good morning everyone. So I am Vishnugaran, Intern UI developer. So in this presentation we are going to learn about how to build complex layout with CSS Grid. Due to the time limitation, we are unable to cover the full session. So that the discussion, let's have to look basic feature of the grid system. What is CSS Grid? CSS Grid layout is a two-dimensional layout method that gives you control over items in rows as well as columns. Imagine a grid system similar to Bootstrap or Foundation that makes it possible to lay out web page without using additional libraries or external grid systems. With the CSS Grid, we can lay out elements on the page along to two axes, that means horizontally and vertically. And CSS Grid support the latest version of all major browsers and can be safely used with the fallback. Grid container. The grid container is the one of the properties in CSS Grid. CSS Grid consists of horizontal and vertical grid tracks, which means similar to rows and columns. The grid tracks define the grid items, that mean grid cells, that are the easily identifiable by the row and the column. The grid container is the HTML element that contains the wall CSS grid. To make an element into grid container, we need to use either display inline grid property. The former results in block level grid, while the latter leads an inline level grid. In the CSS, we use display grid on the container element to create block level CSS grid. Next slide will be grid item. A grid container contains grid item. By default, a container has one grid item for each column in each row, but you can style the grid items so that they will span multiple columns and rows. Next one is grid cell. The space between two adjacent grid column lines, two adjacent grid row lines is called as a grid cell. We can specify size and location individually grid cells using the grid row and grid column properties. We need add two properties to grid cells we want to the position. Next one is grid lines. The lines that divide the column and rows of the grid. There are numbers starting with 1. The lines between columns are called column lines, whereas the line between rows are called row lines. Next one is grid area. This is an important thing of grid area. In fact, it is possible to implement any kind of complicated layout with the CSS grid. However, if our grid gets too complicated, it can be tough to follow up with all the rows and columns by just referring them by their numbers. To help developers overcome this hardship, the CSS grid also make it possible to define pre-named grid areas that are easy to remember. Grid area either specify names for the grid item or is shorthand property for the grid row start, grid column start, grid row in, and grid column in properties. The grid area property can also use assign a name to grid item. Name grid items can be referred to grid template areas property in the grid container. Next slide will be grid template columns. The grid template column CSS property defines the line names and text sizing function of the grid columns and the number and the width of the grid layout. Further, specify the size of the column and how many columns in the grid layout, and the values are spaces separated list where each specify the size of respective columns. Next one is grid template rows. The grid template rows property specify the numbers, that means I, of the rows in grid layout. The values are space separated list where each value specify the height of the respective row. And now one is grid gap. The grid gap property defines the size of gap between rows and columns in the grid layout and is a shorthand property of the grid row gap and grid column gap. We can use it quickly and gaps between the grid tracks. And the grid template area. The grid template areas property specify areas within the grid layout. You can name grid item by using the grid area property and the reference to the name the grid templates area properties. And grid auto rows and columns. The grid auto rows property set a size for the rows in a grid container. This is property affects only the rows with the size, not a set. Samely, the grid auto columns property sets the size of the column in a grid container. The property affects only the size, not a set. Placing a grid item. The CSS place item shorthand property allows you to align items along to both block and inline direction at once in relevant layout system such as a grid or flexbox. If the second value is not set, the first value is also used for grid. Finally, building a layout. In this part, final code and output view after placing the grid items in a layout and detailed coding explanation will be given in demo session. Related demo session will be conducted by Srimali. Srimali, you can carry on now.
Thank you, Vishnu. Hi everyone. I am Srimali Ranawaka, an intern UI developer. Now I am going to do a demo to explain how we can use the grid in our projects. First of all, we see how can make the grid container and grid items. In here, I made the parent container, and inside that I made child containers. Now, as you can see here, all the child elements are aligned one after the other because default CSS property is display block. So to enable the grid on a section of your page, first we need to convert the parent container to a grid container by adding display as grid to the CSS of the parent container. Let's do it now. All the items inside the grid container are called as grid item. After saving it, you will notice absolutely nothing changes, and that's just fine. Grid by itself doesn't define any rows or columns for us to work with. So by default, it just looks exactly the same as normal divs inside of a container. What you need to do to make grid become an actual grid is to define specific columns or rows for your grid. So to do this, you will use grid template, and then you will say columns if you wanted to find your columns, and in here you put list of all the different column sizes. If you want, you can use percentages, pixels, and whatever you want to define your sizes. For example, if we wanted to have 200 pixels column and 100 pixel column, after we save this, you can see we have 200 pixel column in the left and 100 pixel column in the right. And then our grid perhaps to the next row where it has another 200 pixel column in left and another 100 pixel column in right. So our grid is essentially 2 columns wide, and it has a 200 pixel column and a 100 pixel column. But if we wanted our column to flexible size themselves based on the item inside of that, where we use what's called the fraction units. So instead of the 100 pixels, we can use fraction units. 100 pixel columns. Let's say we wanted this to be the one fraction of our size, and instead of 200 pixels, we under this to be 2 fractions. This works exactly as Flexbox does for FlexGrow, and that the 2FR is going to the same as the FlexGrow of 2, and 1FR will be the same as the FlexGrow of 1. So essentially 2FR will be the twice as much space taken up as 1FR. If you when to save that, you can see that the items on the left here is over first column are twice as large as the item in second column, and that because of the FR units that we define. And also we can do same thing for our rows. So we can do grid template rows instead of columns. Then let's say we want to have 200 pixel tall row for our first row, and we want our second row to be 100 pixels tall. When we save this, you can see we now have the 200 pixels row for our first row and 150 pixels row for our second row. But if you don't know how large your grid is going to be, so you don't know how many rows it will be, you can use what's called the grid auto rows, and this will determine the size of all rows, and that get added after our template rows. So for example, we can put, instead of this, we can use grid auto rows. For example, we can put in that we want all of our rows to be 150 pixels tall. So if we save this, now all the rows that are not defined, with the case we have no defined rows, so all the rows will be 150 pixels. Now we can talk about the spacing our rows and columns apart from each other. Can do this with the grid gap property. So we have the grid row gap which return the space between our rows. What's for example putting in here 20 pixels. When we save this, and now we have 20 pixels between all of our different rows, and instead of our grid we have exact same property for columns. For example, we can put grid column gap also. For example, we can put 10 px between all of our columns. You will see when saving how we have 10 pixels between our columns, and if you want the same value for both the rows and columns, you can just use the grid gap property instead of these two. If you want to same value for both rows and columns, you can use this grid gap property which sets both the columns and rows gap to be 20 pixels in this case. And now you see we have 20 pixels between all of our different grid items and the row and columns. And next, for the most part, all you need to know about is sizing your different columns, your different rows and your gaps. There is only one other way in which you can lay out your columns and rows, and that's using grid template areas. Grid template areas allows us to create different strings for areas that you want your different sections take up. So in our case, let's say we want to have header and another header. So we want our header to take up the first two rows just like this, and then we have one of our grid items, say grid 1, and in this case we can give the grid area of header in here. Now if you save this, that you can see that the template area, our entire first row is going to take up the space of this header. We can even define further rows after that. So let's say we want our next row to be sidebar and then content, and then again sidebar and content. So we can use our grid 2 item here. We can set this to be sidebar as a grid area as the sidebar, and we do same thing for grid 3 item also, and we are going to make it grid area as content. And when we save this, you will see that we have a sidebar on the left side here and our content on the right side here. So these grid template areas allow us to name our different items based on an area and then position it in our rows using the template concept. Now we are going to talk about how we can align our grid container and our grid items inside of our container. This works very similarly to how Flexbox works for aligning items using the align items and justify items. So in our case, there's two types. We have the items and the content version of align items and justify. So there are aligning items and justify items, which is how we lay out the different grid items inside of our container, and there is justify content and align content, which is how we lay out our actual grid container inside of the container that's inside of. So let me show you an example by justifying our container and aligning our container. And justify content property defines how the browser distributes space between and around content items along the main axis of a container. For that, first we see justify content as start. Start is the default value. In that case, the items are packed towards the start item, packed towards the start of the main axis. And next value is justify content, and then the items are packed towards the end of the main axis. The next value is justify content center. The items are centered along the line. The next value is justify content space between. In that case, the items are evenly distributed in the line. First item on the start line and the last item on the end line. Next value is justify content space around. In that case, the items are evenly distributed in the line with equal space around them. Next value is justify content space evenly. So here the items are distributed, so the spacing between any two items is equal. The next way to align the grid item is the align items. The align items allow us to align items along the cross axis. To move the items to the start of the cross axis, we can use align items as start. And similarly, to move the items to the end of the cross axis, we can use align item as end. Similarly, to move the items to the center of the cross axis, we can use align items as center. To fill the container using the items, we can use align items as stretch. And that's all about the CSS grid. I hope you all get an idea about the grid, and we hope to do another session for complex layout, how to make complex layout using grid. And as the browser support for the CSS grid has improved a lot in the recent years, you can begin to safely use it in web development. To learn more about CSS grid layout, check out the presentation slides, and thank you everyone.